Okay, today we're dealing with the Walkinstown Cromwell myth. Look, I grew up in Walkinstown. My parents are from both uh, inner city to Drimlin, Crumlin, and eventually settled in Walkinstown. And there was a myth that grew up in Walkinstown, and I really think this only started around when a lot of the schemes and housing estates were built in the late 40s, early 50s, and this was the what I called the myth of the Cromwell myth, that somehow Oliver Cromwell and his army um, came to Ireland and camped in Walkinstown, or what would have been specifically the Beachfield, Cherryfield area of Walkinstown, with his army. Um, and ultimately, like I'll disclose here before the start, there's no historical evidence for that. Let's move on. Despite much local folklore, there is absolutely no factual evidence whatsoever that Cromwell ever set foot in Crumlin, set up camp, stayed overnight, or that any of his soldiers, 40,000 in total with artillery, ever did. Much of the myth is based on local hand-me-down stories, generation to generation, that a mix of multitude and conflation of historical facts. Okay, so let's deal with what are those facts. Cromwell's movements and those of his general army were well detailed in history. He marched with troops directly on landing in North Dublin to Drogheda. He arrived there less than 48 hours later. So, look, think about it. Foot soldiers, artillery, heavy weaponry at that time. You couldn't pick up a bag of chips for an overnight stay. Lodge at the Border, which is where Beachfield is located behind in Crumlin, and do that, and then suddenly miraculously arrive with all your artillery in Drogheda 48 hours later. There was no trains, there wasn't movement, wasn't cars. Everything was artillery, had to be moved on carts, horses, and on foot. You couldn't arrive in Dublin port and then suddenly go to Drogheda 48 hours later and go, oh, do you know what, we'll pop off for a bag of chips and Borzas and camp out in the Beachfield, and then we'll head off to Drogheda and be there 24 hours later. You know, the idea even logistically is utterly nonsensical. Cromwell's fort in Beachfield did not exist until 100 years after Cromwell's time in Ireland. Though called a fort, it was actually an estate, not a battlement fort. Cromwell bequeathed land of the Dublin baronies as war reparation to his generals. From the 1700s, the land of Beachfield Crumlin was owned by the family of a former Cromwell general. The Shaws and later Wilkins, Flanagan families, and there were other families, were involved in this exchange of tenancy between absent landlords. The appearance of Cromwell's fort coincides with Cromwell's centenary, and this is important, and when an ancestor of one of his generals moved to Ireland to set up that family estate behind the Borza chipper. You know, you see where I'm coming from. The idea is utterly nonsense. More than 100 years before Cromwell arrived in Ireland, King William did indeed set up an encampment in Crumlin. This is where the conflation begins, historical conflation. This is well documented and likely where the historical conflation began. He documents leaving Dublin City in diaries and arriving at a church off to the left. This is St. Mary's Church at the end of Crumlin village, leading to a small village, and describes Crumlin in great detail. And he does describe it in great detail. To begin with, and apart from tradition, the earliest printed reference to Cromwell's army and Crumlin appears to be that of Oliver's namesake Thomas Kitson Cromwell in his book Excursions Through Ireland. The Parliamentary army under Cromwell encamped on the common at Crumlin, and under numerous stripes of the land were portioned out by him to victorious soldiery. Thomas Cromwell quotes no authority in support of that statement. Herein is the problem. John Dalton, the historian of County Dublin, published precisely the same statement in 1838. In other words, he's just copying what Thomas Cromwell wrote, also without quoting his authority. However, there is good reason for believing that Dalton simply copied the statement of Thomas Cromwell. It should be the case, then the story unwinds as follows, and by God, it does unwind. Let us begin with Thomas Cromwell. Who was he, and where did he obtain a statement relating to Cromwell's camp at Crumlin? Thomas Kitson Cromwell, to give him his full name, was an Englishman born in 1792. He survived until 1870. He bore the character of a respectable antiquary and was a member of the Society of Antiquaries, London. He wrote a number of books and contributed many articles to literary and historical journals. It might be expected he would be tempted to write about his historic kinsman Oliver. He did, the title of his work being Oliver Cromwell and His Times. This effort in biography was described by Thomas Carlyle rather contemptuously as vaporous and insignificant. He subsequently visited Ireland and about 1822 published his Excursions Through Ireland, in the second volume of which he presented his statement involving Crumlin. As already remarked, this appears to be the first printed statement, and it seems obviously built up on information contained in the letter from Ireland of 1649. He's referring to that Thomas Cromwell letter. Let it be noted that Thomas Cromwell appears to have been attracted by King's Land, which he italicizes, and it is to be assumed that he had read of the Barnwell family's property at Drimnagh adjacent to Crumlin. But it would appear that neither Thomas Cromwell nor the writer of the 1649 letter knew that Lord Barnwell mentioned in the letter was Viscount Kingsland, which estates were near Donabate, County Dublin, and near Nannywater River in County Meath. There is no doubt a Ballygart Castle on the Nannywater, but it is not Belgard near Crumlin. And the story is now complicated. We had better restate it in this way. Barnwell of Crumlin and Barnwell of Turvey, Donabate, the Kingsland, Crumlin and Kingsland of Donabate, Belgard near Crumlin and Ballygard, County Meath. It now appears likely from the foregoing that both Thomas Cromwell and the writer of the letter were confused in their geography of County Dublin, and it is to be particularly observed that Erlington Ball, in his authoritative and well-documented history of the county, completely ignores the statement of Dalton and Thomas Cromwell, though it cannot be imagined that he, Ball, was unfamiliar with the work of either. Note too, the Ball recorded the chief historical event in which Cromwell was concerned was the encampment there for 2 days after the Battle of the Boyne of King William and his victorious army. Therein is your answer to the myth. It seems reasonable to conclude, therefore, that both Cromwell, Thomas, and the writer of the letter were both sadly deficient in topographical knowledge of County Dublin, and it need not be wondered about their knowledge. The 17th century, a portion of the Crumlin lands came into the possession of Major Joseph Dean, an officer in Cromwell's army. You see, this is where the real key history is and what this comes back to. It is said that Captain's Road is named after him. In 1780, the antiquarian Austin Cooper visited Crumlin and recorded that it had very few houses, mostly the country retreats of citizens. St. Mary's Church was rebuilt in 1817 by aid of a loan of £1,000 from the late Board of First Fruits, the old medieval tower being preserved. The handsome classical doorcase in the east wall is an extremely fine design by a skilled architect and very probably dates to the early 18th century, making contemporary with the boundary wall. This is likely where Cromwell and the Crumlin link comes in, but 40 years later. I think what we have is an historical mix of two separate events of Cromwell and King William woven together over generations and passed down to us through our parents. And therein is the problem. I'll give you a few moments just to look at this text. I'm not going to read through it all. Again, it's another historical text I found about the parish of Crumlin and the village of Crumlin. Talks about a number of people, but again, it connects a lot of what was happening at the time in the would have been the 16th century. Okay, you can pause it if you need to and read it more. Okay, so this is, I believe this is a text from Billy French, who's a local writer, and this is a kind of speech he gave about the books he wrote about Walkinstown and Crumlin, and this was a speech he gave at a university address. I'm just going to read a little bit of it. After the battle, the clan arrived, the young chief's body to be buried in Glassmall, where Eleanor was found a few days later, frozen to death beside his grave. This is in reference, I think, to Drimnagh, the legend of Drimnagh Castle. Some legends say she was drowned in the moat as a kid fishing, whether I believe this story. Crumlin village in those far-off days of my youth was a real village, the true sense of the word, lying as it does between two crossroads. One between Crumlin Cross, Our Lady's Hospital is now where Our Lady's Hospital is now situated, and at the other end of the village at the crossroads of Kimmage Road West and Cromwell's Fort Road. Why so named, I don't know, as there is evidence that Cromwell ever set foot in or near Crumlin. Again, there's an awful lot of talk about where Crumlin Crossroads is, I believe it was accepted locally that there was two between the um, Walkinstown area and the running into the Kimmage Road area, and then the opposite end of by the Children's Hospital, where the entry would have been from the city, in where that stone monument is. The village itself was the hub of the parish, having a post office, dispensary, police station, forge, schools, church, chapel, and of course a pub. It also had a first-class GAA pitch, several soccer pitches, a pipe band, and the grandest lot of unemployed men you'd ever wish to meet in a day's walk, for these were the hungry 30s and 1930s. If you remember at the start of my talk, this is again Billy French talking, I mentioned the many and varied types of working clothes you would see on men in Dublin City on a weekday. Well, the men in the village and surrounding district that stood outside the pub every morning, and there were a lot of them, all wore the same type of clothing: cloth cap, rough woolen coat, scarf and trousers tied with string or grass called yokes. This was the case if ever they were lucky to get a day's work with some farmer. The yokes would prevent field mice and other vermin running up their legs as they worked, landing potatoes, snagging turnips, or saving wheat or hay in the fields around the village. Cabbages were pulled by women in the early hours to make the Dublin market while still fresh. Look, that's it. Cromwell in Walkinstown, off the Cromwell's Fault Road in Beachfield, Cherryfield area. It's a myth. It's just been something passed down to you by your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents. They weren't alive in the the 15 and 1600s. It didn't happen. It's a myth. The connection of Cromwell in Crumlin and what would become Walkinstown, it's simply a myth. It's a nice one. It's a great story to tell. I've heard it. I grew up with it. But there's no basis in history beyond local myth. It's a great story for the pub, but that's all it is. Take care. God bless.